linguistics for NLP. I'm Julia. I'm a postdoc at UVM in the Vermont Complex Systems Institute. I did my Bachelor's of Science in Linguistics at MIT, and then I did my PhD in Complex Systems and Data Science at UVM. And this is Ashley. She's a PhD candidate at, also at Complex Systems and Data Science at the Vermont Complex Systems Institute, and we're both in the Computational Story Lab. Okay, so the format of this talk, basically we're combining linguistics background that scaffold NLP tools and then tools with NLP examples. And the goal is, you've probably used some NLP tools or had to do some NLP, and this will hopefully provide some helpful context that can empower your methods in the future. So, big picture, why do we have language? It scaffolds our cognition, which is an intrasubjective role, and it supports our communication, which is an intersubjective role. So it's important for us and between us. It's crucial for individual and collective knowledge and extended cognition, aka time and space travel. So one way to think of language is as a specific kind of information technology that's on a continuum with all coordination. So starting at the one end with like electrical impulses between cells that help them act together, and at the other end, symbolic representations like language. And language is both biological and cultural in its basis. So let's briefly look at the context that gave rise to language as we know it today. So the origin of language. Basically, this is a super simplified version. Everything happens in waves, it's happening over and over again, and then there's a reversion. So the convenience framing is kind of a date, which is like a binary on-off, but that's not really what happened. Okay, so hominids diverged from other primates about 2.5 to 4 million years ago. We start using simple tools about 2.3 million years ago. We migrate out of Africa for one of many times, about 70 to 100,000 years before present. And the earliest traceable story motifs could actually be circa roughly that time period. So there's some theories about maybe stories that have to do with dragons going back that far, the Earth Diver myth, there's some others. So language starts, the kind of broad range of estimates is 10,000 to 1 million years ago. Most people put it in like 40 to 200,000 up to 750,000 years ago. And it seems like it probably predates expansion from Africa. It could go as far back as 550 or 750,000 years before present if it's pre-divergence with Neanderthals, which we don't see any physiological reason that it couldn't be. Humans are not the only animals that use symbolic representations, but human language has a special level of compositional and referential capacity. So basically whenever we try to pick out a thing and go, this is the unique thing about human language, we then find an animal that does that also. So, it's a more complicated than that, but I think there's no other animals that use language in a recognizably human-like way. Now, of course, there are computers. So writing starts about 5,000 years before present, and NLP, of course, is basically being applied to writing, more or less. So if you think about writing language as a cultural artifact that co-evolved with other aspects of our culture and bodies, the NLP stuff is only touching this very tip of the iceberg. Even though we call it big data all the time, it's only this teeny little tip. So, and also there's a lot of echoes of the past that are carried around as linguistic fossils, even today when you interact with this text. So it's not like this ancient history is totally discrete from what you're interacting with today. For example, the name Michael, the L in Michael, is actually the same root as an Akkadian deity. So he would have been worshipped about 4,000 years ago. And we're still carrying around and invoking that today, which I think is really cool. And we can use those little fossils and tidbits to understand ancient history, which bits of culture are persistent versus change rapidly, and in general to learn about human nature and cognition. So words as our primary substrate of cumulative knowledge are unbelievably important for how we do things, which makes NLP sort of a really powerful field. So let's try to see how we understand this incredibly complex, rich signal called language. So the basic levels of linguistic analysis are phonetics or phonology, which has to do with sounds and sound patterns, morphology, which has to do with word structure, syntax, which has to do with sentence structure, semantics, the meanings of words and sentences, pragmatics, which is meaning and context, and discourse, which is language across multiple utterances, so like at the conversation level. So we're going to start with small structures, which is pieces of words, and then work our way up. Okay, morphology. So morphology is sort of the backbone of a lot of NLP tasks. Parsing, tokenization, types and tokens, lemmatization, stemming, NER, normalization, co-reference resolution, entity linking, canonicalization, dependency parsing, part of speech tagging, and constituency parsing are all morphology or syntactic based, so it's relevant. Words are really complicated to define, like perhaps surprisingly so, but universally, there are some patterns, word-like things encode information about time and space, but they're not necessarily always chunked into something recognizable if you're most familiar with English, like English parts of speech. And there's blurriness between what counts as a word, a phrase, or a sentence, which we'll get into a little bit more later. So important foundation when you're talking about symbolic representation, there is both arbitrariness and innateness in language. For example, in the picture here, most people have pretty strong feelings about which one of the blobs is Booba and which one is Kiki. If you think the one with spikes is Kiki and the one that's rounded is Booba, that is basically a universally shared opinion. And that is robust across like quite a few languages and cultures at this point. So symbols that we encounter in language have both an arbitrary and an innate component. And that ties into some really interesting aspects of language acquisition. For example, we're very good at segmenting speech sounds into words, even though that's somewhat underspecified by the actual sound wave itself. And part of the story of how that is happening must be a statistical analysis of input data carried out by the child or the language learner. And we'll come back to that with the distributional hypothesis because it's relevant to how LLMs are now learning language. So a morpheme is the minimal subpart of a word that expresses a meaning or a grammatical property. For example, dogs, you can break into dog and S, when the S indicates plural, and the dog points to the referent, which is an animal. Okay, so important distinctions and terminology for morphology. We've got bound morphemes versus free morphemes. So bound morphemes cannot stand on their own. So the I's in industrialize, or the Asian in industrialization, those are bound morphemes. They can't be words by themselves. Whereas industry can be a word by itself. That's a free morpheme. And in English, we break things down into open class content words. So that's like nouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives. These you can add a new word as a new concept arises. The computer, internet, those are relatively new words. On the other hand, function words, these words are things like the, in, that, of, which. Those words are a closed class, meaning you don't really add new members. So if there's one class of words that you can add members to and one which you can't, the one which you can't is going to be the better way to define what language a text is occurring in. So if you've ever seen, so basically the closed class items are the ones that can identify a language, which has NLP applications. If you've ever seen Jabberwocky, the Lewis Carroll poem, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toads did gyre and gimble in the wave." None of those content words are recognizable English, but because the function words are, it's pretty easy for you to parse what's happening and recognize it as English. So, okay, words are trees. They're not 1D symbols, 1D strings of symbols. And this is important because this will come into play when we're considering how a computational model can interact with that data versus how that data is likely being represented in the mind of a human who's interacting with it. And we know that words are trees because of rules about how different pieces of words can combine. the only way it makes sense for, like the only way you can explain those rules adequately is if you allow there to be a tree structure underlying them. And morphemes don't necessarily have just one sound or spelling. So for example, the plural one, which we mentioned earlier, dogs with a Z, cats with an S, oxen, children, sheep, deer, those are all different morphemes, different surface forms of the same morpheme. So they mean the same thing, but they're spelled and they sound differently. That has NLP implications because allomorphs of the same morpheme don't necessarily have the same surface forms, and NLP is going to be interacting with the surface forms. Okay, syntax. So morphology is at the word level, syntax is at the phrase and sentence level. Syntax is basically like morphology, but for larger linguistic structures. The most important theory from it is Chomsky's universal grammar, which is the position that language is an innate part of the human mind or brain shaped by cognition, allowing children to acquire it despite the relative poverty of linguistic input by restricting the necessary search space. And there's an argument about if you want to take like a strong UG stance or a sort of lighter stance, but if you think of it as in opposition to framing language as this sort of abstract process that's entirely separate from embodiment, it's like true at some level, although people disagree about at what level it's true. That this has implications for LLMs. They're learning from distributional patterns, but that isn't happening in a vacuum. They also have their own architectural constraints, just like we do. Okay, and syntax is determinative of meaning. So, for example, Janet claims that she likes pizza versus she claims that Janet likes pizza. In the first sentence, she can mean Janet, and in the second sentence, it's much more difficult to understand how Janet and she could be the same person. So the syntax is what's allowing us to understand those relationships.
Okay, awesome. Any questions before I move on to some examples? All right. So I'll briefly talk about some applications of morphology, even though just parsing words writ large is an application of morphology. Anytime you're doing it in NLP, you're applying some kind of knowledge to how you want to structure your meaningful linguistic units. Usually it's at the word level. So when we talk about types or tokens, I think we're often talking about word level, but there's other types of linguistic units, such as parts of speech in open and closed class, or other types of tokens that have different implications. But one example is using measures of morphological complexity. So you could simply apply like a type to token ratio. This is just a simple division of number of types over number of tokens in some body of text. Or you could measure entropy in some amount of text, and this gives you the predictability of the language. You might use this to compare languages or bodies of text in how complex their makeup is. An example is whether speeches are coherent. Maybe you want to compare speeches made by different authors or different people or different authors or something like that. It could give you some idea of the complexity in terms of their word choice, their syntax choice, stuff like that. English in particular is actually not usually considered morphologically complex, but it does have high entropy because of its many irregular forms. So these two measures do provide a little bit of orthogonal signal. So kind of interesting to just like run that easily on when you're doing like some exploratory game analysis or descriptive statistics. It's something to throw in there. And then last, these measures are interesting because we ultimately use a lexicon to encode novel concepts. So whatever words we have available to us, we are reusing and combining in different ways to convey something different, because the types and tokens that we're using convey information when arranged differently. So morphological complexity, even just type-token ratio applied to that, sort of breaks some of that down eventually. So there's some kind of meaning there. But this especially looks different across languages, which is something to keep in mind. I think a lot of the work we do tends to be pretty English-centric. But like, for example, Turkish and German have long, complex words that build on each other, that one word can equate to some meaning that's a phrase in English. So when you're counting types across languages, they're not necessarily apples to apples, like comparable. It's just something to keep in mind to explain one of the differences you might be seeing in language complexity. But yeah, so an implication is that counting types across languages isn't straightforward. All right, so next I'll talk about the allotaxonometer, a tool from our computational story lab, and we're not doing any live demos, so if anyone wants links to anything, just like feel free to catch us after and we can share them with you or email them. There's papers, links, sometimes websites that people in our center have worked on that lead to some of these tools, and they're fun to play around with. So the allotaxonometer, or as we love to call it, the allotax, is a tool from our lab, and it counts types or tokens just as a base level. So to use it, you'll want to determine your linguistic units, so often words, clean your text, so applying any morphological considerations. And then when you actually use the tool, which I'll show on the next slide, you're basically counting your types in 2 bodies of text and then comparing their rank distributions to see how they diverge, what's important in each. It sort of gives you a little bit of a fingerprint of what they're doing compared to each other. So the allotax lets you compare not only text and how the word rank distributions diverge or how they're similar, but you could use it to take 2 bodies of text and compare topics that appear in them, or speech register of how 2 groups talk, or the tone in which they talk, or stylistic features of anyone who's written anything. It's pretty diverse. Any 2 categories or groups that you can imagine, you could compare those 2 bodies of text in it. So this is a figure, and this one in particular is from a paper by Dodds et al., which again we can share. This is from like the publication-ready version. There's other versions of the allotax. Yeah, so this one here is from the main paper. The paper itself also tells you how and what the math is underlying these red outline parts. So if you like to dig into that and sort of understand mathematically what's happening, beyond the simple explanation that I'm offering, then I definitely will encourage you to read the paper, and I can link it. So this example, on the left you have data, we'll call it in one system or body of text, and on the right you have data in another body of text. This example took tweets from 2 different days on Twitter, so an election day on the left, and then a protest on the right, the Charlottesville protest. And on the left, you see words at the bottom. These are going to be more rare words in the left corpus that stick out or diverge more from rare words, or from words generally in the right-hand corpus. So this gives you an idea of not only how highly ranked they are, but where they start to diverge. And then the split histogram on the right tells you how much more some types contributed in the divergence between the 2 bodies of text. And this can be used for analysis or exploration. Some people like to put their data in and just sort of start to see what pops up. You know, we don't have time to read like millions of documents. So this is a way to see like maybe some of the rarity, some of the rare lexicon, common lexicon, how it's starting to surface. It could also tell you maybe how good or bad your NLP parsing is. Some people have used this and seen data abnormalities and been able to use this to fix that. Things didn't get parsed right, could pop up, seem like they're important, but really it's just an artifact of poor parsing or something. So one of the things to know about these distributions is that a word's number of meanings roughly follows a power law, which is a concept that just underlies a lot of this type of work. And this is related to linguistic efficiency, such that more frequent words tend to have more meanings, and those will be higher up in the diagram. Those also tend to be function words, which isn't super surprising. But your rare words could tell you something a bit more pragmatically because they have fewer meanings, and those are going to be at the bottom where you see the deep red or deep orange. But the allotax distributions can ultimately give you a signature of text against its comparison, and the more common lexicon could tell you about the style and register of each body of text. So since we've applied morphology and sort of talked about that a little bit, there's more analysis and tools that we can apply, and one of them is treating text as a time series, which is a pretty common method for us in the complex systems program at UVM, so it's sort of worth going into, even though I think a lot of people probably do time series stuff, maybe not all the time to text. So a text time series just means analyzing something over the progression of text from its start to its end. It could be a book, it could be a conversation, A lot of the stuff we've done in some of the complex systems courses, we use classical books, so I'm using, all of these are going to be on Frankenstein for the next few slides, so it has a lot of dark turns in it, some happiness, but you can see sort of within the first third how it starts to downturn, and then it downturns at the end because some pretty gruesome stuff happens if people have read it. But yeah, so in some ways that we investigate text in a time series could also be looking at the intervals between when things happen. So the intervals between the same types or words, parts of speech, or any other engineered feature that you can place in a text timeline, like when it happens. Sometimes these distributions of inter-arrival times can tell you interesting things, even statistically or normatively, about what to expect in your type of domain. Like, I think inter-arrival times can look different in novels and in conversations, maybe than in newspaper. These are just some examples, but interesting stuff. So some things that do greatly affect our signal are how we progress over the text. And these, the graph on the left versus the graph on the right implement a little bit of a different progression measure. So on the left, we have a sliding window calculation, and these are all calculating calculating average happiness using a dictionary called LabMT, which again we can link. It's open source. It's people having rated the happiness of words, a very large lexicon. So you can start to sort of parse that. You can use that to parse text in a number of ways. So on the left here, we applied a sliding window. So this is a finer grain of a number. This is a fine grain over a number of words, say 1,000, and then we shift the window by 1, do another calculation, shift it. So we have many more calculations than doing discrete window chunks like 1,000 words, the next 1,000, the next 1,000, and this gives you a little bit more fine grain, and maybe like you can see the trajectory a bit more finely, which is why we say like shifting window calculation. But either way, you're going to usually have to try multiple window sizes or grains to go from really noisy on the top to less noisy on the bottom to figure out like the level at which the signal actually matters for your domain, your body of text, stuff like that. There's no like one size fits all. But we want to use tokens, more tokens in Windows when using lexicons because of how variance or noise in the signal pops up. So with the sliding window and with more tokens, I kind of mentioned this, but you can see trends that have a longer duration, like starting to go down toward like under 5.6 happiness is actually pretty dark for Frankenstein. Rather than these being pretty like jarring fluctuations on the right, we have an idea of like where the plot might be heading. So that basically preempts an actual tool that we have. Those were some manual calculations, but we have this tool called the Shifterator, which we have. These are all from the website Dewey. So if you wanted to, it's like pre-populated with a bunch of books, movie scripts, I think tweets, and many other projects on there as well. This example also uses Frankenstein. If you look at the curves, it's pretty similar where the dips are. Let's see. But yeah, so again, this is calculating averages of words, and you can select portions of text to compare, which are the yellow blocks on the left. So you have your, here's going to be my reference group, which is the beginning of the book, the first block here, and I want to compare it against the comparison block, which is the other one. That's one thing that it allows you to do, and it sort of points out the importance of choosing a really good reference for what you're comparing against, because the middle of the happiness scale is 5, but that's not relative to anything, it's just a center point. Whereas the average happiness of the entire Frankenstein book is actually slightly higher than that, surprisingly. But in the bottom, you can also increase or decrease the blocking lens around happiness. So this is extremely helpful to get words that contribute maybe more or less extremely to the score, rather than words that people may have massively rated pretty neutral or average. And then on the right, you can see words in the how words in the comparison group stack up against the reference group along specific words that have increased or contributed to increases or decreases in the happiness score. Lists them out specifically. So from the beginning to the end of the book, there's a lot of death and dying and not too much happiness, but there is some of it that increases throughout. But again, with the reference and comparison, we'll hit on this a few times. We're just stressing the importance of having a meaningful reference group for any NLP. So in this example, Frankenstein's happiness is over 5, so it's more interpretable to compare against differences, to compare any differences in the book against that if it's skewing above whatever the center point on the scale is, rather than 5, which is just an arbitrary center. But a good reference group goes beyond that, because text can skew various ways, whether it's word choice, punctuation, or length of dialogue turns. Sometimes just running descriptives on your different linguistic units that have meaning can sort of tell you how maybe your corpora or various mediums that you're working with might be different than what you think they are. But that's it for this section of tools. Any questions so far? We've thrown a lot out. And always happy to share these after if people want to chat. Cool. Next, Julia will talk about language change and the distributional hypothesis.
Yeah, and just to reiterate those, the allotax and the shift reader, there's Python packages for those that are publicly available if anyone wants to use those tools themselves. So that's time series, which is sort of text over time, but within a fairly narrow scope, right? Within a single work or a few works. So what if we want to look over a long time or compare corpora that are coming from different time periods? If we want to do that, then we have to take into account the fact that language changes. So language is not at all static. The same word will likely mean different things or take different surface forms over time. But luckily, there are patterns to how languages tend to change. That I'm going to break it down into like 2 main components of that. One, metaphor. Metaphor is a key mechanism of language change. So for example, there's a lot of processes that fall under the umbrella of metaphorical extension, where you're using metaphor to create new meanings. So grasp something with your hand becomes grasping an idea mentally, right? There's a lot, that's a very common sort of type of process in language change. And there's also a sort of a pressure of efficiency, which I'll get to in the next slide. So one of the other main drivers of language change is lectio, difficilior, potior, which is an expression from classics meaning the most difficult reading is the correct one. So this came about in the context of, you have 45 versions of the Bible and you want to understand what relation those translations have to each other and which of them is sort of the older text. So the most difficult reading being the correct one, things tended to get simpler and normalized over time. And that's true, so that example is at like the sentence level or like the idea level, but it's also true like even at basically all scales of language, including at the word level. So an example is Middle English pronunciation of the word night would have been something like knicht, which is longer and harder to say. So over time that became physically easier to articulate, simpler and shorter. So those efficiency as a driver of language change, it sort of reflects a general balance between expressiveness and effort. So we want to be able to express anything we could need to say in language, but we want to be able to do that within our resource constraints and using the pieces that are already familiar to other speakers, right? So those two things are sort of in tension with each other. And there are pretty common like NLP tools and metrics that are built on those ideas. So Ashley already mentioned Zipf's law or Heaps-Hurden's law or Minzerath's law. Those are all like statistical observations about how language tends to arrange itself. And one of the underlying putative mechanisms is these pressures of efficiency over time. So this has connections to tokenization and LLMs because one of the most prominent strategies for how we tokenize LLMs is to use byte pair encoding or things related to byte pair encoding. And the point of that is that given some text, byte pair encoding allows you to choose what symbols to use to represent that text such that you've maximized your orthographic efficiency. So that depends on sort of the orthographic features of the language. And that allows you to pack as much data into your model as possible given the model's memory. And it's kind of cool that if you run, like, if you're trying to just, so tokenization like BPE is totally meaning agnostic. It just cares about the surface forms of the words, like the array of symbols, right? And it's kind of cool that you get human-like words and phrases as tokens out of that, because that suggests that given that setup, there's some kind of relationship between information theoretic efficiency and those units, which is like cool. So something that often happens when you're talking about a time-extended corpora, words can come to mean their opposite. This should be raising like a million red flags if you're ever thinking of doing NLP things. So an example, awful meaning full of awe. Now it means bad. Sometimes it means good, as in awfully good. Oh, awfully good of you, it's very British, but. So these words that even within one speaker can have opposite meanings. So computational models of language may then need to be incorporating pragmatic cues in context as well as distributional patterns in order to interpret meanings appropriately. So that brings us to meaning construction. How is meaning being constructed? Okay, words are hella important, but their meaning changes a bunch. That sounds complicated. How are speakers learning these words, and how can our computational models be learning them? So, sort of the foundation of NLP everything is the distributional hypothesis. It's the cornerstone of distributional semantics, which is the foundation of many tools. It's basically the idea that meaning can be acquired by using the distributional properties of language as the building blocks of semantics. J.R. Firth summed it up as, "You shall know word by the company it keeps," which is like a more fun way to say it. So it's unclear how much of human language acquisition is actually achieved through these means, but we know some is. That's been experimentally validated in a bunch of ways. And it seems like there's something like two regimes happening. On the one side, there's the initial pattern matching, where you're making associations between words and you're making associations between words in the world. At the other end, there's once you have some mastery over those words, you can combine them together to create abstractions, which you can do more with. So there's two things. First, the pattern matching, then the abstractions are the kind of two regimes of learning that are supported by this. And that there's some evidence that this is not unlike what's happening in LLMs. And if you think about what they're like architecturally capable of perceiving, the DH has to be like the main component of how they're learning. Okay, so, anytime you've inferred the meaning of a word you didn't know in a conversation with somebody, that's you using the distributional hypothesis. And it's kind of cool how fast people can do this. You can hear a word and only in one or two examples basically know what the word means, which is cool. So the two things we were talking about, there's patterns in how words appear together, and then there's patterns in how words relate back out to the world. So given that those are the patterns, what are the mechanisms that support those patterns when you're observing like a sequence of symbols? Basically, there's two strategies. There's the relations between the words, and then the relations between words and other things. The relations between words, that's called morphosyntactic encoding. And then the relations between words and other things, so whether that's an entity that exists in the world or a more complex concept, that is called lexical encoding. So every language uses both strategies, morphosyntactic encoding and lexical encoding, but it's kind of like tuning a dial. Like languages can skew more one way or the other. And it has NLP implications for sort of the structure of the vocabulary that's going to go along with a language depending on which of those mechanisms they favor. So for example, if you look at English compared to Turkish or Russian, there's fewer inflectional endings, but a massive vocabulary thanks to Germanic and Romance layers. So in English, we have big, large, huge, and enormous. Those are lexical encodings of size contrast, whereas in another language, you might use a grammatical marker to distinguish between those different sizes. And there's implications for NLP and LLMs, and specifically with respect to the primacy of language for thought, or the choice of to make tokens important to how LLMs think, because since LLMs can perceive relationships between symbols, but they cannot directly perceive the world, it would make sense that they're going to have much more facility with inferential lexical competence, so the things that have to do with relations between the words, rather than things that point back out into the real world. Okay. So there's two sort of things happening here. The locality of things, so in order to relations between things make things local to each other. So basically, in order to act on information, you have to have some way of making that information accessible or salient. And that's what those relationships are sort of powerful for. And that idea that everything is related, but things that are close to each other are more closely related to each other, that's baked into the structure of language, and it's a prominent assumption in NLP tools. So if we have these sort of two ways of learning, then we can also start using the abstraction component, so recursion, composition, hierarchy, abstraction, like layering these pieces together to get more complex, more complicated ideas. And reference, so pointing out to something else using words, that supports our cognition and communication because it allows us to pack more information locally into the same amount of resources. So it's a compression capability. So the aspects of compression and the aspects of reference, these are meaning-making techniques in language founded on the relationships between symbols. And given that computational models have curtailed access to the world, and language is the essentially only medium that they're encountering anything through, this has like huge implications for what it might be possible for them to understand and under what conditions. So that brings us to semantics, the symbol grounding problem specifically. So the ability to interpret and assign meanings to things. And the symbol grounding problem is the challenge of how abstract symbols like word or tokens acquire meaning so that they connect back to real world reference or experiences. And this is sort of like a big open question in AI in general. So something to acknowledge is that when you read like a dictionary definition, so for example, cat, a dictionary definition of a cat is not going to, it can tell you a lot that you need to know about cats in order to complete certain cat-related tasks, but it's different from the experience of interacting with a cat in real life, like the sensory component of petting a cat or hearing a cat purr. So the approximations that you can make in text or in symbols of something in the world are sufficient for some purposes, and there's no reason to think they can't be arbitrarily good, but they're never going to be identical to direct sensory experience. So we have some examples here of what LLM meaning can kind of look like. So this is looking at, if we take a bunch of token vectors for bank, passing that in context through a Roberta, which is a mass language model, and then doing UMAP and PCA, which is a dimension reduction, matrix decomposition, and then doing a clustering on top of that in order to produce these clusters here. What we find is that those, the sort of organization of the clusters is surprisingly human interpretable. It's based on context, frequency, syntax, semantics, and it's very fine-grained types of meaning. We've got the financial institution of bank, all of those are outlined in green, and then riverbank type meanings, like physical instances of bank on the other side. And then those are further subdivided into pieces, even as far as being relational versus descriptive. So like an incredible level of detail in how those meanings are being organized. And excitingly, there's sort of some hints of like an underlying world model or indirect grounding here. For example, there's these two groups of bank of something, like you could say bank of clouds, bank of gas, bank of ores, and that's grouped into man-made things and natural things. And then the natural things is grouped into like intangible things like cloud and gas and mist versus rubble and brick and like stones, like physical things. So an NLP implication for this is that if you embed some instances and then classify based on those clusters, you could get like extremely fine-grained classification of word senses, like much better than existing tools. So highly recommend that method. So as we've given these examples of how sensitive meaning is to context, an NLP implication of that is to be extremely wary of computational models that claim they detect misinformation, disinformation, truth, something like that. Because what is it that they're really detecting if those claims are based only on diegetic information, so the stuff that's in the text? Truth is a thing that is very unlikely to be directly embedded in the text. Okay, so that brings us to context in general, which is in linguistics pragmatics. So it's the study of how context, speaker intentions, and shared knowledge shape the interpretation of meaning beyond the literal content of words and sentences. And this is getting incorporated in LLMs. So if you've ever used an instruction-tuned model like ChatGPT, then that's a model that's being its initial sort of language faculty that it learned through next token prediction is getting pragmatic information layered on top of that with the instruction tuning. So it's being taught to consider sort of what's relevant, what's truthful in sort of in a kludgy way.
Okay, we're definitely not going to get through all the examples, but I think just here we're going to emphasize context as a clearly very rich linguistic signal. I mean, even if you're just looking at punctuation, this example looked at punctuation as fingerprints across different books, and you can clearly see that there's a lot more use of some punctuation on the left versus right. And this can tell you maybe differences between like language medium, purpose of the text. There may be punctuation can embed some prosody, like there's some implied punctuation in the way we talk and how we speak that sort of gets flattened when you turn speech into text and then do further analysis on it. So taking punctuation into account, especially based on the type of text you're looking at, if it's transcribed from people or if it's people texting or talking online, based on the medium on which they're talking and whoever is doing the talking, how the platform might limit them, punctuation can be some signal as well as word choice. And this is just a little more. The author of this research had gone into some books, so I'm going to skip over it. I'm not going to get all the way through this tool, but our lab had also produced a tool called the Oozeometer, which it's basically building on a model of affect to place words in like meaning dimensions. So there's some dimensional reduction here on how people think about and rate stuff like valence and arousal and dominance of words that boil down to two axes, which I'll talk about briefly. That go from words fall on a weak to powerful axis as well as a dangerous to safe axis. And this just, the picture on the left here is just the one-dimensional representation of that. But there's quite a lot of papers on this, and you can use the lexicon of scores in numerous ways. Same with how I talked about happiness scores, how you might apply that between groups or throughout speeches to look at narrative arcs, but like even just looking at the meaning that's been basically dimensionalized here on the horizontal axis, you're going from weak on the left being words like inactivity, emptiness, void, to powerful on the right being passion, excitability, and champion, and then on the vertical axis you have dangerous at the top going from homicide, wrath, terrifying, toxic, going to safe words at the bottom, which might be more like childhood, reassurance, storybook, and stress-free. So the way that people think about words, especially when there was some analysis done on this, on the boiled down to like what I'll just call power danger scores, like how words fall along these axes showed up safety or positivity bias. A lot more words fell toward safe and less dangerous, and this mirrors a positivity bias in written expression, which is interesting. All right, and I think we probably need to wrap up.
Yeah, I won't go into the history of writing. Basically, the takeaway here is that different populations speak language differently, and that many NLP tools increasingly rely on machine learning models which learn language based on some specific corpus. So you need to ask yourself, like, what kind of language was this model designed to interact with, and what was it trained on?
Yeah. Laundry list of questions for doing NLP responsibly, including thinking about who the speakers are, the medium of the text, how the data was produced, especially if it was methods from, even a few years or decades ago. There's artifacts that are different to how data is digitally, natively recorded now. Whether there's registers or community speech or genres in your text, that's important to know, especially if there's like norms in how communities speak, like online, different subreddits have different vocabulary. We don't have time for this example.
No, but if anyone wants it, we went through an example of like anger, and like if say you wanted to understand anger in some text, and then we went through like, here's how this would tie to morphology and syntax, here's what tools you could use. So if anyone's interested, happy to share later.
Yeah, that's it, thank you.